I brought hardtack for you tonight, which is the basic bread ration for the United States Army. Nice and soft, easy to chew. This is only 5 months old. I had this baked for my undergraduate class this year. If you keep it for about 3 years, it'll be just right for what hardtack was really like. But so everybody take a piece of hardtack, add it to your collection. I have some that's about 11 years old that I haven't broken out yet. They issued some of this during the Civil War that had been baked during the war with Mexico to give you a sense of how long they could keep it, basically forever.
Who bakes it for you?
Who bakes it for me? This guy in Gettysburg who caters to the reenactor community. That's my brush with the reenactor community. I have them bake my hardtack and send it. I get 500 pieces a year and pass it out. We'll get all of this show and tell stuff out of the way now. I told you I would bring a musket with me tonight. And I did bring a musket with me tonight. The largest maker of muskets during the Civil War was the Springfield. They were made in Springfield, Massachusetts. This one is, again, they couldn't make enough for the United States Army. There's sort of a hubbub in here. I'm just going to stop for a minute until you all gather yourselves. So they had various other companies make them to exactly the same specifications, and that's what this one is. This one was made by Savage Arms, and it is identical to what the majority of the United States soldiers at Gettysburg would have carried, and very like what the Confederate soldiers would have carried. It's 58 caliber, and it has rifling in the barrel, which makes all the difference, as we've talked about before. The old smooth bores fired just a musket ball like this and had a range of about 100 yards, an effective range of about 100 yards, not quite 100. By putting rifling in the barrel and using an elongated round, which we all call mini balls, it should actually be called a Burton bullet. It's a Frenchman named Minier came up with the initial design, but this version of it is an American named Burton developed it. It has a hollow base. I'll pass this around too. The problem with rifles was that they had to have fitted rounds, and they fouled quickly. You couldn't fire them as rapidly, had to clean them more frequently, so they weren't practical weapons for the mass of your infantry. The problem was, how do you get one that would fire as quickly as a smooth bore, not have to be cleaned more, and this solved that problem. This round is a little bit smaller than the caliber of the weapon. Because the base is hollow, when you fired the round, the base expanded, engaged the grooves, and you now had a weapon that has an effective range of probably 250 yards. Instead, it'll shoot a lot farther than that. And you'll read in some books that the soldiers could shoot 1,000 yards with them, and it'll shoot 1,000 yards. You wouldn't know what you were shooting at 1,000 yards. But 250 yards versus 100 yards is a huge difference. So when you walk the Pickett Pettigrew assault, you can imagine what a difference that makes as you go across there. So I'll pass the mini balls around. These are actual ones dug, and I've passed them around for so many years that the patina has worn off that one. It looks like it's brand new. This one still looks the way they don't pass this ball out as well. This would have been a modern weapon in a couple of ways then. It's the old flintlocks used to have a pan on the side. The expression flash in a pan comes from the powder in the pan on a weapon, but this has a nipple that takes a little device called a percussion cap, which doesn't look like much, but it's revolutionary. It's much faster, you have far fewer misfires and so forth. And this is, when you cock the hammer to there, it's on safety. The expression "don't go off half-cocked" comes from this. If it's half-cocked, you can't shoot it. If it's cocked all the way, you can. So now I want a volunteer from the audience. Anybody, quickly. Somebody. Please come down here. I'll even put the bayonet on for you. Here you go. Most bayonet scabbards were leather. This one is metal. Has a big US on it, so we have a clue as to which side used it.
That's not necessarily true.
It's not if the Confederates captured it.
Yeah, which is how they got it.
However, I believe it was manufactured for use by the United States Army. That would be my guess. There you go. There's the average Civil War soldier is about 5'7". Not nearly as tall as this. You are 5'7". You're an average Civil War soldier. Here's your percussion cap. Put it, don't aim it at any of your classmates. Just, I'll let you cock it, put it on there, and aim at that blackboard over there. A good infantryman, a veteran infantryman would probably fire. That's it. Here we go. And that's just the percussion cap. Here, now you have a souvenir. That's yours. There you go. Anybody else want to do that before we get going? Nobody does. There are a few more percussion caps here.
Janet wants to do it.
Pardon? Janet, you do, you don't. You don't.
I'm good.
You do, but you don't.
I do, but I don't.
I'm also going to pass around a fired mini ball, and this is why the wounds to extremities were so hideous and why there were so many amputations. That's just soft lead, and when it hits anything hard, it mushrooms like this. I'll pass that around as well. Here you go. Get your percussion cap. Here you go. It goes down here. On the nipple. Pop it all the way back.
This is just the powder.
Pardon?
Just the powder.
Well, no, there's no powder there. The powder would be inside the barrel. Ooh, that's called a misfire. What? No, I think you've got a defective cap. That's the problem. Try it, Sean.
Oh, that was used.
Try this one.
That's the use of it.
I like the casual aiming style he has, like this. That wouldn't have impressed your non-commissioned officers to aim that way. Here, do you want this percussion cap? There you go. You're the only one on your block. I'm going to pass two more things around, and one is a piece of canister, which is one of the rounds mentioned there. This is the kind of round that infantry feared the most. It's like a big shotgun that would spread out. It would only come toward the end of an assault, maybe the last 400 yards. And this is a shell fragment. Civil War rounds did not hit the ground and then detonate the way they do in all the movies. They had fuses that detonated in the air, broke into fragments, and the fragments came down. This is a fragment of a round, and this is a piece of canister. There you go. All right, now. Yes.
Just a question about the canister. What type of what did those look like?
They came in essence a tin container. There's a picture of it right there. Picture on your one handout, a tin container filled with these are iron balls. And when you fired it, the container broke apart and the iron balls fanned out. It's like a shotgun. Same kinds of cannons fired all four major kinds of rounds. Wow. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
A question about the muskets, about the manufacturers. I mean, if you commission from one manufacturer, and then could you buy from another one and interchange the parts?
Great question that Michelle has. Do these have interchangeable parts? If that Savage musket, something went wrong with it, could a Springfield part be replaced? And the answer is yes. It could. It could. Anybody have any questions about any of that stuff, Scott?
How did the fuse? How did that work?
If I'd had one more arm, I would have brought these things. They have internal fuses, the rounds do, not a cartoon fuse that has, then you light it and then throw it at something. It has an internal fuse, and it has numbers on it, and what you would do is estimate the distance to your target, and then cut the fuse to detonate at that distance. If you were lucky, it would. If you were a Confederate, it probably wouldn't, because they had bad problems with their fuses. But when you fired the cannon, the flame wrapped around the round, that lit the fuse, and then off it went. And if it worked just right, it would explode in the air 800 yards or 1,200 yards or however far out it was. You'll see when you're on the ground with the Marines that one of the real problems that the Confederates had with their bombardment preceding the Pickett-Pettigrew assault is that their fuses were malfunctioning. The fuses were detonating late. A scholar who teaches at UNC went through the ordnance records from one of the major Confederate ordnance labs in South Carolina and found that their fuses were detonating late. And then he thinks a lot of those fuses ended up with the Army of Northern Virginia, and that was part of the problem with it. It's very hard. Artillery then isn't nearly as precise. It's never exactly precise. Really wasn't precise then. Very hard to hit a shallow target. And that's part of what the Confederates were trying to do on the 3rd, too. They had a fairly shallow target, and they didn't hit very much. They hit a lot of stuff in the rear. Echelon.
The manufacturing of the guns, like, where was that happening?
Who was making the rifles? Mainly in the Northeast, mainly in New England. Massachusetts, the largest ones in Massachusetts.
Sold them down to the...
Oh, you mean to the Confederacy?
Yeah.
Oh, no. The Confederacy captured about 100,000 muskets from the United States armies during the war, imported about 600,000 from Great Britain, and produced more than 250,000 themselves. So they got them from various sources. Britain, all of the European nations dumped their whatever crummy weapons they had around on the United States and the Confederacy early in the war. And throughout the war, the British made Enfield rifles. Hundreds of thousands of those were sold to both sides. That was a very good war for the British if you were involved in anything relating to weapons and weaponry. Anybody else have something about any of that stuff? If not, let's go to unfinished questions. Carrying over from last time, did you leave deeply dissatisfied, Pete, with something? Did we?
No, I did not. I was actually asked one more thing about the,
Okay, ask one more thing.
where the bayonets placed, is that where it would be like off to the side? I always thought it'd be like underneath or on top.
No, well, they had sword bayonets that would be underneath, but no, they're off to the side. This is it. I mean, this isn't like what, as all the students say, is that like what they were carrying? No, this is what they were carrying. It's not like what they were carrying. That's what they were carrying. So you march 20 miles a day. That's your average march when you're just going somewhere, and that's part of what you're carrying. Weighs about 13 pounds. That's 13 pounds of the stuff, of the 40 to 50 pounds worth of stuff you're carrying.
How many rounds would they typically carry?
They would typically carry 40 to 80. They would have a little, pouch that carries 40, but they would often stick other cartridges here and there. Figure fire twice a minute. If you're a veteran infantryman, you read in lots of books they were firing 3 times a minute. I think they probably more often fired 2 times a minute, and probably a lot of times fired 1 time a minute, because a lot can go wrong when you're loading one of those. The cartridges are very unwieldy. They're paper and powder and paper, and you bite and pour and bite and ram, and it's the ramrod is right here. Pardon? The ramrod is I didn't want to turn this into this. A cartridge is this, with a piece of paper glued to the bottom of it, then powder poured inside that, and then that's twisted at the end. And then all of that is put inside another piece of paper. And those are put in a cartridge pouch. You have a cartridge pouch and a cap box. You have percussion caps in one place and your cartridges in another. Take the cartridge out, you bite the end off, you pour the powder down, you put the round down, you put the wadding down, and then you're ready to fire. And there are a number of very specific steps that you're supposed to follow to fire, and they would be observed to a greater or lesser extent depending on the circumstances. If you're on a firing line, sometimes the soldiers would stick their ramrod in the ground rather than replacing it each time. They just have it there. Many of them, many times, in the heat of battle, they'd leave the ramrod in inadvertently and fire their weapon, and the ramrod would go out with the round. And then they would have, but that's what it's for, and this is where you put it. That is where you put it.
So you have other type of bullets in there, or just
This is it. It either looks like this or like the musket ball. But overwhelmingly, they look like these. There are a few units at Gettysburg that still have smooth bore weapons. A handful of units. Most of them had these, it's called a rifle-musket. Not rifled musket, it's rifled, but they called it a rifle-musket. Yes?
So you still shoot like a real...
I could, yes, we could go out and we could shoot a hole in a stop sign with that. I don't because, I mean, it's in perfect, yes, it absolutely could. I wouldn't because it's, I have a replica of that I used when I used to let students shoot them. We'd go shoot the replica, but not the original. But you could, certainly could shoot it. Yes, you could. And they're amazingly accurate. They really are. Anybody else? Was that a sort of very subtle?
You kind of made fun of Louise for firing from the hip. How common was it
To fire from the hip?
No. How disciplined was their firing practices generally?
Their firing practice, they were taught, you fired a lot of rounds without, and hit relatively few people. And what they really did was put down a volume of fire. A lot of it wasn't even specifically aimed fire. A lot of it was, and they might start with a series of commands that would end up with a volley, but once you were really engaged in a fight, you would be firing at will. You'd be firing it at your own pace. But you wouldn't be firing the way Luis was, unless you were almost on top of someone, walking toward them, and then you might fire that way, but otherwise you wouldn't. Luis?
How much was precise, anyhow, those bullets? The canoid or the musket?
Right.
What's the precision if you aim it?
If we walked over to Scott Stadium and you stood under one goalpost and I stood under the other one, I would hit you most of the time. With whoever has the actual, look at it, it's a collection. Let me see. Let me have this thing. If I'm shooting this at you, the musket ball, the chances are if you just stood still, I wouldn't hit you at 100 yards. With this, I would hit you. And then I'd hit you again if I had another chance. It made a huge difference. It made a huge difference at that range. Huge difference. This is like a knuckleball. When it comes out of a smooth bore weapon, it comes out and it starts to do this and it's headed toward Pete and it doesn't get to him. And this one hits you right in your Boston Red Sox hat if you're in a fairly decent range. So there's a very significant difference between these two. It's often exaggerated in a lot of books. They just extend the range. Oh, they could kill people at 400 yards, 300 yards. 300 yards is a long ways. It is a long ways. And even 250 yards is a long ways. But it's a big difference.
So what's the cost difference?
Cost difference? You mean to manufacture them? None. It's all the same stuff. It's just that that one has, however much it costs to rifle that is the cost difference. Because
why they use the musket? Why they bought it? Why they use it?
They used it for the reason I said. They hadn't found a way to make a rifled weapon serviceable for a typical infantryman that could be fired as frequently and cleaned as infrequently as the earlier rifles. There are rifles during the American Revolution. Pennsylvania rifles, Virginia rifles, Morgan's riflemen, but they are you can't put a bayonet on those kinds of rifles. They take much longer to load because they have a round that you practically have to pound down in so that it engages the rifling. The key is this is slightly smaller than the caliber of the weapon, and it's the hollow base that is the key. That expands when the powder explodes and engages the rifling. And so this doesn't look like much. This is a significant breakthrough, and so is the percussion cap, a significant breakthrough. Michelle and then Justin.
I'm not sure if they had the physics right, but that one...
Don't ask me any physics questions. This is more aerodynamic.
Yeah, but when it hits the body, it would break in more pieces than the other one?
They don't break into pieces. They do this.
In the body, so infections would increase.
Infections are terrible.
After that.
And medicine does not treat wounds in the trunk.
Mm-hmm.
Triage there is they set you to the side and you either live or you don't. I mean, they literally don't treat them. They might close them up a little bit, but there's nothing they can do.
Mm-hmm.
So they treat wounds in the extremities. That's what they spend most of their time on.
So do you know, there was an increase in the ratio of infections once there was a change?
You mean in the kind of round?
Yeah.
No, there'd be just as high a rate of infections with these as there's no difference there.
Okay.
No difference there. It's Justin and then Scott.
I was going to say, is there anyone who doesn't know what rifling is in the rifle?
I didn't even think about that.
In the what?
And I won't ask because someone might have to say they don't. Rifling, a barrel that is not rifled is just smooth on the inside. And so you have this round ball coming out of a smooth barrel. This isn't aerodynamic. It comes out, it starts to do this, and eventually it drops. It doesn't. Rifling is, it's machined into the barrel. You have a groove that's machined into the barrel. And what happens is that when this is fired from that, it spins as it's coming out. It goes like this, which means you gain accuracy and distance. Those are the two things you gain with this and rifling over this and a smoothbore weapon. And you'll see both kinds of artillery on the battlefield too. Any piece of artillery with a green tube while you're there is a smoothbore. Any piece of artillery with a black tube while you're there, and most of them are either 3-inch ordnance rifles or what were called parrots. The guy who invented them was a parrot, named Parrot. They are rifled. And with the smoothbores, you can figure 1,500 to 1,800 yards in range. With the rifled pieces, you can figure more than 3,000 yards with range, more than 3,000. And there are a few pieces you'll see if they take you up on Oak Ridge. There's a British cannon there called a Whitworth. All the cannons you're going to see, except 2 or 3, are muzzle loaders, just like this is. You load it from the muzzle, not from the breech, which is in the back. But you'll see up by the Eternal Light Peace Monument, they have a Whitworth gun, which was a British breech-loading rifled weapon that had a range of about 5 miles. It would fire 5 miles. And don't be impressed, you can't see anything 5 miles away. In the Civil War, there's no indirect, you don't have spotters who are radioing back distances. You shoot at what you can see. So it's nice that it shoots 5 miles and irrelevant, basically. Basically irrelevant. Scott.
In the book, it talks a lot about how they were firing while they retreated, and
They don't mean they're literally firing while they're not retreating and firing because you have to stop to load.
And so I'm trying to picture on a battlefield where you're 300 yards apart and stopping for 30 seconds every couple steps to load.
You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't stop every 30 seconds to load. What you would do is you might stop on the first day when they talk about what's going on there. What you might do is you're out, if you're in Francis Channing Barlow's division, which is out on Bloker's Knoll, it's now called Barlow's Knoll, and you read about him in one of your essays. He's out there, that position crumbles, so he begins to fall back. What you might do is fall back 500 yards and form a new line and try to hold there for a while. And then, but it's not, you don't go 20 feet and then everybody stops. It would be more organized than that, usually. It takes a long time to load one of those. And of course, you're completely vulnerable while you're loading it. You can't load it lying down, not really. Civil War movies have Civil War infantry firing from trees. Only someone truly stupid would get into a tree because you'd have one shot and then you're in the tree. And they know you're in the tree and you can't reload your weapon in the tree. So there you are, you're in the tree. Any of you have seen the movie Shenandoah? Filled with some really dumb Confederates. They're in the trees and vulnerable in the trees.
And when they were retreating, would they just abandon the artillery?
Well, the artillerists would hope not. What you would try to do usually is the guns would come off first, and then the infantry would go later. And as you will see, that's part of the problem the United States artillery had on Sickles' part of the line, because he didn't have enough infantry everywhere. I know this is all inside, this is too inside the beltway for a lot of you, but I'm going to answer anyway. They didn't have enough infantry, and so there was artillery by itself on much of that line, right opposite the peach orchard, and those guns were extremely vulnerable. And they lost a number of those guns because they couldn't get them off.
I know one of the essays talked about the use of the smoke screens or whatever.
They're not smoke screens, the weapons just produce a lot of smoke.
Right, so because of the smoke, when you're retreating, would it ever be used?
Can you hide in the smoke?
Yeah.
Well, the battlefield would be a smoky place. And it's more of a problem when you're imagining yourselves as Edward Porter Alexander overseeing the cannonade before Pickett Pettigrew assault. What happens there is after about 10 minutes, the guns have produced so much smoke that he can't see very much. He can't see Cemetery Ridge very well, and it would be a problem that way. But it isn't used, it's never used in the way that you're talking about. It is not a part of your tactics. Let's lay down some smoke and get closer to them, or lay down some smoke and get away. No, doesn't work that way. Even firing that one time, you'll get smoke. If you fire that 6 times, your face will be black, basically. You'll have powder all over your eyes, you'll have powder in your mouth, you'll have, it's a really dirty weapon in that regard. Black powder is really dirty stuff. And you'd have all over yourself very quickly. And if you figure you've got 15,000 people firing those, and maybe 100 cannon firing at the same time, and if there's not a breeze, then you would get a tremendous amount of smoke on a battlefield, tremendous amount. Now, anything to carry over from last time when we focused on the upper echelon of command? Any lingering questions? Yes?
I know we focused a lot on kind of what the post-Civil War perspective is of Lee, but I was more interested in what was Washington at the time, like what was Lincoln and his cabinet's opinion of Lee?
Of Lee?
How did they kind of see Lee at the time, and then what were the Union troops, how did they see him as well?
Lee is a bugaboo to people in the United States, to civilians, to politicians, to men in the Army. I think most men in the Army of the Potomac, if they had been in their comfort zone and really willing to tell the truth, they would have said Lee was a better soldier than anybody in their army. That's what I think most of them would have said, at least until Grant got there. And even then, probably a lot of them would have said that. He had a mystique, much of it earned, but part of it just, he kept on going, even though he had a mystique that carried him past Gettysburg. Gettysburg had no effect on Lee's reputation. Absolutely none. Absolutely none. And which I think is remarkable. Jake?
Didn't Lincoln ask Lee for command?
Lincoln didn't, but the United States government, Lincoln was aware of it,
Right.
and Lee was offered command of the Union Army that was making up outside Washington in the very early days of the war. Yeah, he was. In April of 1861. He met with Winfield Scott and met with a well-connected old Democratic politician whose family was very influential, had been in Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet and so forth. His name was Francis Preston Blair Sr. Lived in Silver Spring, and they were in Missouri and in Silver Spring, and he's the one who actually made the offer to Lee. And Lee turned it down. Okay. What about subordinates? That's what we're going to talk about today, and that's what you read about. Any things occur to you about, and I think we'll start with Confederates and then move to the Federal subordinates. You have essays on an array of them at different ranks on each side. You had essays that deal with every one of the Confederate Corps commanders, with Ewell and Hill and Longstreet, not one that deals with Jeb Stuart, but with the other ones. You have an essay on 3 brigade commanders who had terrible days on the first day, a day of mostly success for the Confederates. You've read a lot of Porter Alexander, and so just somebody start with some thought about, yes?
Yeah, I just was amazed when I was reading about Pendleton and Lee and the fact that Lee left Pendleton in position, and it kind of talked about there were political reasons for that. But I would love to get some more insight.
You mean Wilson? Now, William Nelson Pendleton, who's the chief of artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia, an older fellow. Yes, he looks like Lee. I think Lee liked him in part because he was very religious, just like Lee was, and was good at some things. But what he's not good at, and I'm not sure that, I think that comes through in the essay a little bit. He doesn't exercise much direct command during a battle. The less, the better. He does a little too much at Gettysburg. He undoes some of Porter Alexander's, and Porter Alexander, of course, is apoplectic about it. The hot shot and the old man. I mean, the old man, he just wants, Granny Pendleton is his nickname, Granny. And that tells you a lot about him. I think Lee kept him on because he was good at some things. He'd overseen a significant reorganization of the Confederate artillery in the autumn of 1862. Originally, artillery was assigned to infantry units. So you'd have a battery of artillery assigned to a brigade of infantry. What the Confederates did, and they did it first, is they gathered their artillery into battalions. And so you would have 4 or 5 batteries in a battalion. Porter Alexander was technically a battalion commander at Gettysburg, but he ended up commanding much more because he was so good, and they kept putting him in positions where he did more. But you would have a battalion of artillery commanded by a colonel, and that would give you a much greater potential massing and more effective massing of your artillery fire. It was a real breakthrough, and it played out for the first time in the Battle of Chancellorsville, the one just before Gettysburg. And Porter Alexander was a star there. He's a star everywhere. But he stuck 40 guns on one piece of high ground at Chancellorsville. And that was possible because of this battalion organization. You're all going to be reorganizing things in your lives, I'm sure, and trying to get greater ease of deployment or use of resources. And this change from batteries attached to brigades to battalions of artillery and a core reserve of artillery, it's a vast improvement. And Pendleton had a lot to do with that. I'm going to finally get back to that point. It isn't as if Pendleton had no skills. He did have some skills, but he shouldn't have been the chief artillerist in the Army of Northern Virginia. And I think with Lee, it was a combination of things. Partly that Lee knew that the tactical work would not be in Pendleton's hands. It would be in the hands of younger officers. There's a corps chief of artillery in each corps. Then the real heart of the Confederate artillery service was in the battalion commanders. And that's where the really best artillerists were. Alexander's the best of all of them. He ends up being promoted, but he's really in charge. He gets given responsibility far above his grade, really, at Gettysburg, far above his grade. And yes, Janet.
So the essay, kind of following up on Mimi's question, the essay seemed to say that it was his fault that he didn't kind of coordinate the artillery.
Pendleton's.
Yeah, right, Pendleton's fault that he didn't coordinate the artillery efforts. But then it also obviously mentions that Lee was there, so it's kind of his battlefield and his show.
Overall, it's Lee's show, but coordinating the artillery that's not really. That's why you have a chief of artillery. And the contrast with Henry Hunt is striking. Henry Hunt is a really superb chief of artillery, but what that essay talks about and what Porter Alexander talked about retrospectively, he never saw the whole battlefield. When he was at Gettysburg, he saw his part of the battlefield. And which means that here's Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill and East Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top and Round Top. Porter Alexander commands the guns here, about 150 of them, and you'll see they stretch for about a mile. What he only realized after the war is that it might have been possible to bring Confederate fire from several directions if the main point of attack had been here. You could have used cannons from the 2nd Corps, from the 3rd Corps, and maybe even a few from the 1st Corps. That's on Lee. Because Lee decides where the attack's going to be. So that, according to Alexander, is on Lee, and he's right. But he thinks that Pendleton could have made better use of some of the guns a little bit farther north on the field than he did. Apart from not taking those howitzers that Alexander had very carefully positioned to follow up the artillery and be in position to support them with full ammunition chests, and then he looked around for them and they were gone. And Pendleton had moved those without telling Alexander. But of course, Alexander had placed them without telling Pendleton. So it sort of goes both ways. I think Alexander probably figured Pendleton would be a complete non-factor in the real battle, and that he, Alexander, would be in charge of the artillery part anyway. And when that fell apart, there was no support. They fired up all their ammunition. Yes, Jeff?
It seems like from reading this that there's a huge lack of information and that it takes a long time for information to flow up. So any sort of tactical decision needs to be made at a really kind of a low level, and that someone like Lee needs to trust not even like his corps commander, even his like division or brigade commanders to be able to do things.
Yes.
So it's still surprising that like on day 2 Hood didn't take the initiative to go around the Union flank.
He tried. But he can't. Why can't Hood take the initiative?
So that's what's
No,
surprising.
you didn't mean that, but you should have. Damn Longstreet is right. That is Longstreet's fault. Hood tried to do that.
So is that just like a kind of a personality flaw in Longstreet that he wouldn't give up that command and recognize that he doesn't?
You want my opinion here. My opinion is Longstreet's making a point there. He doesn't want to make the attack at all. And so by God, he's going to make it exactly the way Lee told him to do it, even though he knows standing there that conditions have changed since Lee ordered the assault. He knows things that Lee didn't know. Hood really knows them, and Hood's the one who's going to go in with his division. Major generals walked in with their divisions during the Civil War. They don't stay in the back and say, go do that. They get their sword in their hand, and Hood gets about 40 yards and gets shot in that attack. So that is entirely on Longstreet there.
So do those lower level commanders usually end up deciding the battles as opposed to people like Longstreet and Lee even?
One of my questions here is, do Army commanders have any control once the battle starts? And you can drop that down. You can drop that on down so that at every point, at some point, a brigade commander tells one of his colonels commanding a regiment to do something, and then goes off and is doing other things. I'll come right back to you, Michelle. And that regimental commander then does things or doesn't do things. So yes, a lot is decided without the chance to go up and down the chain of command. And it's so difficult to get information back and forth, as you picked up from many of these essays. It's really, because people don't know where other people are. You can only send a courier. The courier might not find them. The courier might get shot. Anything might get captured. Lots of things can happen. So once a battle starts, it often takes on a life of its own. And there's a lot of responsibility that ends up on shoulders of officers who seemingly wouldn't have that much responsibility. Michelle?
Yeah, it's on that same token, like on the third day, when Longstreet didn't want to go in the middle, he wanted to go around. But Pickett saw that as his great chance to get screwed, like he wanted to do it.
Pickett wanted to do it, yes.
Because he was
very sorry later, but he wanted to do it on the morning of the 3rd,
if
yes.
he didn't want to do it, and everybody below him apparently didn't want to do it, because Armstead, I mean, they knew they would probably get shot. So if there was they were like more consistent among themselves, could they have not done it, even though Lee was really stubborn about that? Because I don't know how you can blame Longstreet. I mean,
You mean, well, we can blame Longstreet for not letting Hood go farther, because Longstreet is Hood's immediate superior, and they are this far apart. Justin is Hood, and I'm James Longstreet, and he says, General, why don't we go around there? There are no Yankees there, and I say no. And he asks me again, I say no again, and finally he says, I'll make this assault, but under protest. I'm doing this under protest officially. I'm on the record doing this under protest. So in that sense, there's no doubt what's going on there, because we're both in exactly the same place. Lee has given the orders to make this assault. And then, but he's got a line that's a mile from left flank to right flank. You'll get it goes from the McMillan farm on the left all the way down to, you'll see on the ground, it's a very long way. There's no way he can be in control of the whole thing. Yeah. He has to trust that his officers will do what he tells them to do, but the chance that they're just going to say, gosh, I don't want to make this assault, I don't think I will, that's not really an option for them. Not really an option. Some men, individual men, do they drop out? Of course they do. But there are people in the back of the line. You're going forward, you're an infantryman, I'm in the back of the line, and one of my jobs is if you turn around and come back toward me, I tell you to go that way, and if you don't go that way, I am completely within the rules to shoot you. So that's an incentive for you to go frontwards if I'm behind you. Now, did they shoot a lot of people in that sense? No, they did not. But did lots of people break and run? Most of them didn't until they got pretty close to the Emmitsburg Road, which is a long way across the field. Justin, did you have your hand up?
I was just saying, in response as well, I mean, so there's one reading on the 11th Corps and how devastated they were as a unit because of the reputation that they had unjustly
from
Chancellorsville unjustly received. And so as well, I mean, that's kind of both for both sides, a sense of honor, and so they would have seen it as inconceivable to just ignore the orders, especially from someone like Lee.
Yeah, no, I think that wouldn't have entered anyone's mind. Although I think it entered Longstreet's mind to maybe do it. You're fulfilling the letter of your orders, but not the spirit of your orders. That's what Longstreet is doing, I think, at Gettysburg.
Doesn't that make like Longstreet just kind of a terrible human being? Because I mean, we've talked about the loss of life separately, and we've talked about kind of like decisions on the field, but connecting the two, it seems like a lot of these stubborn decision-making and blame games are kind of losing sight of the fact that young men are.
I don't think he's a terrible human being exactly, so I wouldn't attach that to him officially. He does a very
He
good.
did have the worst ethics scores too, right?
He did a very good job in many other places. I think he had a profound disagreement with Lee at Gettysburg. I mean, he really did. He's not pretending to disagree with Lee. He profoundly disagrees with what Lee wants to do. But the point is, he doesn't have the option of not doing it if he's a subordinate. At least that is how that structure works. And we can talk about that if you want to. And we can. What is a subordinate's role? What is a subordinate's role? That's a question. I'm now awaiting answers. What is it? What's a subordinate's role?
It's to follow whatever orders you're given.
Orders or instructions or whatever. If you're in a company, if you're in an army, somebody else. What is it? What do you expect from a subordinate? Luis?
To inform you whatever is happening as soon as possible with the best accurate information as possible and properly give his opinion at the same time.
Of course, a subordinate always should give an opinion. And then what happens when you do all that to me and I say do X? And you recommended doing Y, but I say do X, Luis. Thank you for your information.
I might say why I disagree, or I might understand your point, just do it.
So you might do what I order you to do, and you might not.
No, I'm just saying that if I still disagree, and I have other arguments why I disagree, I would give them.
Yes, you should.
If you told me do this, and I understood, and I agree, then I would do it.
We've just described Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet at Gettysburg. I tell you what I want you to do, and you say, I think we should do this. And I say, well, I don't think we should do this. And you say, but here's why I think we should do this. I listened to you, General Longstreet. I still think we should do this. You do it 3 times. And in the end, I keep telling you to do what I want you to do. And you're my subordinate. So now what do you do?
Follow?
Yes.
I mean, I feel like when we talked about this before, you said either you do it wholeheartedly or you say somebody else needs to take it.
That's my view. That's what I would want a subordinate to do. If a subordinate really couldn't do to the best of his or her ability what I've told them to do, I would want them to say, I have to step aside here. You get somebody in here who can do that and give it their full best effort. Those to me are the choices. Either do it to the best of your or step aside.
So I also think that part of it's on Lee. Like, if he knew Longstreet was not bought in, I wouldn't feel comfortable putting him into battle. I would be worried about him executing correctly. So.
But if you've never had any indication that he would do anything but do his best, and you knew he was one of the best soldiers in your army,
Yeah.
you wouldn't trust him?
But he also never fought back this way, right?
Well, not to this degree, but Lee had actually deferred to Longstreet in other instances. He did it Second Bull Run. He wanted an attack one day, Longstreet wanted to wait another day, and Lee deferred to him. But there's no question who's in charge, and that's a very iffy relationship between a superior and a subordinate. If you're having to try to decide whether your subordinate's really going to give full effort, that's really murky ground, I think. And certainly Lee did not think he was on that kind of ground. Mariel, and then back to Justin.
Couldn't you also argue that Lee sort of had a blind spot when it came to Longstreet, because for so long after Gettysburg, we kept sort of pushing aside rumors that Longstreet was disparaging his name.
He liked Longstreet. Yeah, yes.
So
He called Longstreet the staff in my right hand earlier in the war. He gave Longstreet a nickname. Lee gave affectionate nicknames to exactly 2 people. And Longstreet's half of those 2 people. Called him my old warhorse on the battlefield at Antietam. And that for Lee is just the gushiest kind of Oprah moment. He doesn't talk that way. He's running up and basically slobbering on Longstreet when he says that. To say, my old warhorse, that's an incredible outpouring of emotion for Lee. He's a buttoned-down guy. He likes Longstreet. He trusts Longstreet. He trusts him again when he comes back to the Army. He treats Gettysburg as an aberration on Longstreet's part. And Longstreet isn't the main one he blames. I'm going to quote something in a minute. Justin, and then we'll work our way this way.
Well, that's why I see almost Longstreet's in an untenable position, because I don't think he felt he could, turn down his, revoke his commission, and drop his commission, just because of the devastation it would have done to Lee for Longstreet to give up. essentially.
Oh, no,
And so-
that would have been a radical move for him to say, put somebody else in charge of the Corps.
Right.
That wasn't gonna happen.
And so I think he might have even, as cruel-hearted as it sounds, be less devastating to the Confederate cause for him to lead an attack and get men slaughtered that he didn't believe in, rather than refuse orders. I'm not saying it's the right decision.
I have to add something here. Please don't get into the frame of mind that this is unusual to order an assault like this. This is not an assault. The Civil War is fought this way, and oh my God, at Gettysburg, there's a direct assault. No, no, no. There are huge assaults on the part of the Army in Northern Virginia all through the war. This is not some radical departure from how the Army in Northern Virginia has fought before. So please keep that in mind.
This is the part that doesn't add up for me. He's his old war horse. It's not new. They're together for 2 years. They fought. All this success, most of it happened with Longstreet.
They've been together about 1 year at this point.
He was down in Chickamauga and stuff for a while, right?
Later.
Later. Oh, that was later?
Yeah.
He was somewhere else.
Anyway, they've been together a year, and
he's got a long history with him, and now all of a sudden, the story doesn't add up.
What doesn't add up?
That he rebelled, and Lee's judgment against him was so faulty. You know,
Lee's judgment against him was faulty. I don't understand what you mean.
Lee misjudged him so poorly that he would rebel like a little kid and say, okay, I'm going to do exactly what you say, Mom. You say I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it this way. Because Lee...
Let's pretend we're lawyers for a minute and talk about facts. Here are some facts.
Okay.
Lee instructs Longstreet to make this... Longstreet knows what he wants, what Lee wants him to do. Lee wants him to get... Originally, Lee's instructions are to attack up the Emmitsburg Road because he thought the Union Army ended here. That's the last intelligence he had. When he means attack up the Emmitsburg Road, he means on the axis of the Emmitsburg Road. So the Confederate attack is along that axis, and there's the town of Gettysburg, and there's the key high ground. That's the original plan. And Lee's intelligence was from very early that morning. One of his officers named Sam Johnston had gone out very early in the morning and ridden across what was the wheat field, ridden past Little Round Top, and there were no Federals down there. The Federals were up here, so that's the original plan. Lee gives Longstreet the instructions at the very latest at 11, although Longstreet knew before then what Lee wanted him to do, and he asked if he could wait for his last brigade to come up, the Vanderlaws, Alabamians, and they finally got up at 11 o'clock. Longstreet starts out here, and that's when he started to get ready to march. He didn't have the whole corps ready to go and then go as soon as Law got there. He waited till Law got there and then got ready to go. That, to me, is not somebody acting in good faith. It just isn't. And then he gets down here late in the afternoon and he sees that the circumstances changed. And his best fighting subordinate, John Hood, everybody conceded he was probably the hardest fighting two-star general in the Army, who never shies away from a fight, who sort of welcomes fights. He says, I don't like the look of this, but that is empty. Let's go around there. Longstreet knows that. Hood knows that. Lee doesn't know that. And Longstreet says, we can't do that because General Lee ordered us to do this. He knows that's not true. He knows that's not how Lee deals with his principal subordinates. He does not deal with them that way. You get down to a place and you find the situation is different and you're a 3-star general in Lee's army, you see something that Lee didn't see, and time is of the essence, you have the authority to adjust to the situation. Stonewall Jackson did it at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier.
Stonewall Jackson wasn't ordered to do the flank march?
He was ordered to do the flank march. I'm glad you gave me a softball down the middle. He was ordered to do the flank march, and he was supposed to get to the Plank Road. That's a P. He gets to here's the Union Army. The Confederates thought their flank ended there. So get to the Plank Road and hit them there. He found out that the Union line went farther, so he continued on to the turnpike. Without orders from Lee, without permission from Lee, he sent word to Lee what he was doing, not may I do this, told him what he was doing. He continued the march. It ate up another 2 hours to do that. He got astride the turnpike and attacked from there instead of attacking the way he originally had been told to attack. He made the decision on the ground because he found the circumstances were not what they thought they were when he and Lee agreed on this. There's plenty of precedent.
It's hard to argue with a guy who studied this his whole life.
Well, no, I haven't studied it my whole life. I spent some days watching baseball, but this is an example not that long before.
Yep.
Not that long before. And so he doesn't get off the hook with that either. And I admire Longstreet as a soldier. I think he's a really good soldier. Jim?
So my question is, how does this, when this plays out poorly the opposite way? So I think Sickles is an example of where he kind of took the initiative to take.
And we're going to talk about another one, too.
Right.
We'll talk about Frank Barlow doing it as well, but go ahead.
When it works out that way, where there was, Meade had a clearly, maybe not clearly articulated, but a vision of where the line needed to be and how it needed to be attacked. Sickles saw, arguably for his men, that there was better ground, but it left the rest of the line in danger.
So it isn't really better ground, is it? If you expose an entire corps by getting a better position just for yourself and put the rest of the Army in a vulnerable position, that's not better ground. For the Army, it's just better ground for you, Dan Sickles.
Right. So I guess at what level do you expect people, so is Hood, when he's recommending this flanking movement, is he thinking of the entire Army, or is he just thinking this is going to be better for us?
Well, he's thinking, I think he's thinking both of them.
Okay.
He's thinking we can either attack the way that we've been ordered to attack, but if we just do this, we'll be completely around their flank. And if you get, which is what Longstreet even said he wanted to do from day one. And so if you have we've talked about how they agreed on basic precepts, and one of the precepts is, I can either attack you this way, is what they did, as you'll see. I'm a Texan. I'm looking at Devil's Den, and right behind, Deanna's on Little Round Top back there, and so this is the way I'm going to do it. And I'm Hood, and I'm going to get shot before I even get to Michelle. Or I can do what Hood said he wanted to do, which puts me over here. This is really bad news for you, Chase. If I get over here, the potential for a devastating attack goes up exponentially. If I do it there, coming this way. It's a huge difference, And the whole goal of this is to menace the Union left flank. So, I mean, we can't answer this and say, well, we found the exact answer and that's it and we'll move on. People have argued this forever, and they will argue it forever, and there are some people can be confused about Longstreet. Nobody in particular, no. He has his defenders, he does. I think he was a very good soldier, and I think he knew what he was doing, and what he was doing, in my view, was the minimum of what he could do. And I think he was sort of making a point. And it's a bloody point. Would have been bloody anyway. Still going to be bloody. Luis?
So I think there's a big difference in our conversation we had in this subordinate role. So one is your capabilities, right? If you can't do it, or if you already see in your mind you cannot do it, right? And then the other thing is the point in time you make that decision.
Right.
So if you are talking, and we're talking, and I haven't decided anything, and you say, do this, and
right.
I go in the field and see something different. Okay, I didn't make my final word of my life that I was going to do with you because of circumstances change.
Right.
But, so you were saying that he knew?
He being Longstreat.
Yeah,
okay.
And he knew, but he had also in his mind that he had the capabilities to do it, or he knew and he thought he didn't have the capabilities to do it, and even though he went and did this, did whatever.
What I'm saying is he said he didn't have the option to do something different. But I know that he knew he did have that option, because that's the way that Army worked, because that's the way Lee dealt with his principal subordinates. Lee gave the same kind of order, he allowed the same kind of discretion to Richard Ewell at the end of the first day. He told him to take that position if practicable. This is another example of how very specific language is important for all of you when you're in charge of things, because the same words mean different things to different people. So don't pick words that are subject to interpretation. Take that, if practicable, to Stonewall Jackson means, by God, line your men up and attack and take that place. That's what that means. That's in effect a direct order as it goes in Stonewall Jackson's ear and is processed by his brain. When that goes in Richard Ewell's ear and he processes it, he starts thinking, okay, why might this not be practicable? There's a rumor of Yankees off on my left. I've got 4,000 prisoners I have to look after. Allegheny Johnson's division hasn't come up yet. I'm going to wait till Allegheny Johnson comes up. That's how he processed take that position if practicable. He decided it's not practicable. Lee really didn't mean take it if practicable, so Lee is culpable here too. Lee should have said attack that high ground. But the way he dealt with his principal subordinates before was that way. And then they had, and the execution had always been good. This is why Gettysburg is, it's so jarring for him. I mean, I'll quote him. He never wrote anything down with his name on it that was critical of his subordinates at Gettysburg. What he said after the war, when he didn't think he was going to be quoted, when this former staff officer, the former chief of ordnance, that is, the guy who made sure ammunition got where it was going, for the Second Corps, went and interviewed him at Washington College when Lee was president there. And then he'd interview him, and then he'd go right back to his quarters. This guy's name was William Allen, and write everything down. So he got Lee talking about Gettysburg. And I'll quote this, Allen put it in, he said he did not know the Federal Army was at Gettysburg. Could not believe it. He underlined that. Stuart had been specially ordered to cover his movements, Lee's movements, and keep him informed of the position of the enemy, and he, Stuart, had sent no word. So Lee is very critical of Jeb Stuart there. Jeb Stuart did not do his job, Lee is saying. But then he said, Ewell he couldn't get to act with decision. Longstreet and Hill could not be gotten to act in concert. He's critical of all of them there. Most critical of Stuart, next most critical of Ewell. And then later in this interview he said, Stuart's failure to carry out his instructions forced the Battle of Gettysburg in the imperfect, halting way in which his corps commanders, especially Ewell, fought the battle, gave victory finally to the foe. So Lee clearly was unhappy with every one of his principal subordinates at Gettysburg. A lot of the culpability is his, but the point is he was unhappy with them. He clearly was. I think most with Ewell, but he even includes Longstreet. He says Longstreet fought the battle in a halting way, and I think that is how Lee would have interpreted what happened on the 2nd. He didn't get to where he was supposed to be expeditiously. Once the fighting started, as you'll see, I'm sure the Marines will emphasize this, it's unbelievable what Longstreet's 2 divisions did once they got going. They were attacking, usually the attacker is at a disadvantage. They were attacking more numerous Federals. They inflicted more casualties than they sustained. That is really unusual for the attacking side to sustain fewer casualties than the defending side. And they almost got up Little Round Top. Once they got going, it was a very impressive performance. But Brian, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of more broadly, a lot of these essays focus on errors from subordinates, whether it's like, tactical, cowardice, just leadership. Without a perspective of studying like a lot of military battles, is there a lot more like human error, a lot of stuff, more stuff that went wrong at Gettysburg than we should have expected or happens typically?
A lot of stuff goes wrong on almost every battlefield. The reason we have a lot more information about Gettysburg is because it's just been studied so intensively and written about ad nauseum for almost a century now. I mean, I told you before, there's a bibliography on Gettysburg that's this thick and has 6,000 items in it, and it's several years old now, so now it would need to be thicker than that. I just got 2 new books on Gettysburg in the mail that I'm supposed to review and I have a lot, they gave me a lot of space so I can have a lot to say. And I read the first one already. There's absolutely nothing new in it. It's well written, but it's hard to say something new about Gettysburg without saying something wrong. Because we know most of what happened. The only way to say something new is go to such a micro-tactical level that you're literally dealing with, well, I think these 100 guys right flank was where Laura is. Everybody else used to think it's where Ben is. But it's where Laura is, so that's my big finding. It's 5 yards away. And for Gettysburg nuts, that's a big deal. Oh, did you read the new book? The flank was where Laura is. We used to think it's where Ben is. We're all going to have to change our tours of Gettysburg now. You're down to that point with Gettysburg. You can disagree about the bigger issues, and people do, but the only place where they're really doing something new is that kind of stuff. And that's all pretending. Pretending to be able to tell exactly where a flank was from the Battle of Gettysburg, really, give me a break. You cannot do that. You can approximate it.
What are the records for all of this in terms of, there's so many killed, who's left in a state to accurately record this?
Well, most of them are killed, of course. I mean, the vast majority of them are not killed. Thousands are killed, but many. There may be 50,000 casualties at Gettysburg. That's the high number, 50 or 51,000. That's killed, wounded, and missing. And so the killed are in 5 digits, but no, there's a huge number of people left. And every unit writes a report. And they're at the National Archives, but many of them published in what are called the official records. I wanted to bring one of those in, but I had too much to lug. 127 volumes that average about 1,400 pages each that are just official reports and correspondence from the Civil War. And it's only a percentage of what's in the National Archives. It's just an overwhelming amount. I mean, it's not 21st century kind of overwhelming, but it's hard to try to master this enormous amount of evidence, much of which is absolutely at odds with other parts of the evidence, and that's what you have to try to figure out. You try to go over the preponderance of the evidence, and Michelle, I'm now going to stop.
No,
What?
that's okay.
What's your question?
No, I'm almost making an assumption that, so let's see if you agree, like there's the general on the battlefield, like Lee, is like God on earth, you know, because like in the case with Hood, I mean, even if, okay, he didn't know where the flank was, but he had to go uphill. I mean, people would get slaughtered. That's obvious, even if you don't know where the flank was, and even if you don't know that there wasn't another option.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there any situation where you can go against a general? No, you always have to follow, no matter how insane what he's asking.
I'm going to say again that this is a situation where they didn't have to do what Lee initially said, because these are senior officers on the ground looking at something that Lee didn't know. And they had the authority under Lee's system of command, method of command, culture of command, whatever you want to call it, to make a change, a tactical change at the point of contact. They have that option. Hood, if that hadn't been general knowledge, Hood wouldn't have asked Longstreet to do that. If the culture had been, by God, you do what General Lee tells you to, you do what your CEO tells you to do, period. Even if you find out something that you know should change those instructions, you do it anyway. If that's the culture, John Hood doesn't go to James Longstreet and say, I think we should do this, even though these are our orders now. He wouldn't have done that, because he would have known there's no chance to do that.
In that case, you're saying this is the culture, but I mean, if your general
But the culture's
says,
everything.
But okay, so if your general says you have to go, even if it's going uphill, you have to go. There's nothing that, I mean.
You mean if you and I, now we're Lee and Longstreet again. Mm-hmm. Now we're standing on Seminary Ridge and looking at Cemetery Ridge. We both know the same stuff there. You don't know anything I don't know. Mm-hmm. And so when I tell you to do that, we both know the same things. But when you and Hood are over there and I'm over here and you know things I don't know, it's a different situation. And there you have more options if you're a subordinate. Chase, and then I'll come back to you, May.
I was going to pivot off Longstreet.
Pivot off Longstreet. I'm sick to death of Longstreet. Let's talk about somebody else.
There's a lot about the artillery and from both sides.
There is.
And what I found interesting was both sides seemed to struggle with the organization of the artillery. They were really changing it. So I had 2 questions. One was why, or what precipitated the changes? Were there changes in, I mean, it's kind of 2 years into conflict and we see major reorganizations of artillery.
Right.
Is technology changing, or what's the impetus?
Technology is not changing.
Okay.
Organization is what's changing, and organization makes a huge difference.
So that was my other follow-up question to that was we saw the impact of the reorganization post-Stonewall better.
Right.
So given there's all this new reorganization, what was the relationship like before and after between even Porter and Pendleton? Has this relationship changed
The-
dramatically?
no.
Is that impacting?
It had not. The relationship between a battalion, an artillery battalion commander like Porter Alexander, and just to give you a sense, you're going to talk about all these different units when you get to Gettysburg and how much space they take up on a battlefield. You'll see the regimental monuments, the Union ones, have what are called flank markers. They're very useful. So Michelle is the monument of the 24th Michigan on the first day's fight. And when you look at the monument, it's a great monument. But right over here, there's a little monument that's about that tall that says RF. And that's right flank. It's your right flank. And over here, there's one that says LF. And so what we know by looking at those is that the 24th Michigan, when the battle started, extended from here to here and had 380 men in it. And so on this battlefield, 380 men take up about that much space. It's very useful that way. There are no Confederate equivalents because they don't have all the regimental markers that the United States units do, but it's very useful that way. A battalion of artillery takes up as much space on a battlefield as an infantry division. Infantry division has 7,000 to 10,000 men, and an artillery battalion has 4 or 5 or 6 batteries of artillery. A Confederate battery has 4 guns and a Union battery has 6 usually. But Porter Alexander would not have had much interaction with William Nelson Pendleton day to day. Pendleton was a different kind of chief of artillery than Henry Hunt was. Henry Hunt was a much more hands-on. Henry Hunt was the consensus among Civil War historians, and there's virtually no consensus on anything, is that Henry Hunt and Porter Alexander are the 2 best artillerists in the Civil War. The best Union artillerist is Henry Hunt. The best Confederate artillerist is Porter Alexander. So they're both on that battlefield looking right at each other on the 3rd. And they can move guns around. Hunt does. Hunt was frustrated because he wasn't able to control quite as he thought the infantry was interfering with him. Especially Winfield Scott Hancock. He's a corps commander. A corps commander gets to interfere if he wants to. But they could move things around. They have a fair amount of authority, but ultimately they don't have the authority. The infantry generals ultimately have the authority. May had something, yes.
Pass.
You'll pass.
Yeah, it was about.
It was so long ago, it's a distant memory, isn't it? Well, I wanted to, okay, yes, Bryce.
If I could pick her up.
Yes, okay.
To pivot to a different part of the battle earlier on, a little bit lower with the charge that Iverson and O'Neill
yes.
made. I mean, if we want to talk about just general miscommunication. So
Let's do.
We've talked a lot about Lee.
What rank are they? What level are they?
Are they division generals?
They're brigade commanders.
Brigade
and they're in Robert Rhodes's division.
Okay.
Robert Rhodes is a young, very much up-and-coming officer who will be, in another year, one of the best division commanders in Lee's army and will get killed in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864.
So I guess my question is, we've talked a lot about the culture up at the top of Lee's hierarchy, where Lee gives his orders but then offers a lot of latitude generally to his subordinates to make decisions on the field as they see.
Right.
Does that culture filter down? Does that help explain why O'Neill and Iverson kind of weren't in communication, that they were just kind of charging in headlong into disaster?
I hope the Marines spend a little time with you there, because it's a wonderful way to illustrate just how hard it was to find people competent to command at each level. And I'll remind you again, you cannot remind yourself too often of this. It would be like a company growing hugely, extremely quickly, and then trying to find enough personnel to fit all of the jobs you have. Remember, the United States Army has 15,000 men in it in 1860. And so there are enough trained professional officers to staff an army of 15,000. Well, here at Gettysburg, we have 165,000 men, and overall, we've got 1.5 million in uniform. It's going to be hard to find enough people to command all of that, and that's a perfect example on Oak Hill. There are 2 guys there, Alfred Iverson and Edward O'Neill, who are not soldiers, who don't know anything about being soldiers, who both become governors after the war and prominent politicians in Alabama. But the point is, they're not really good soldiers, and they're clueless. And Iverson is a coward, besides. There's no doubt about that. And they are right next to each other in this attack. Pete, I'm the Union defending there, and Pete is coming at me. He's O'Neill, and Ben is Alfred Iverson, and you have a pretty full-blown disaster, and you have the biggest brigade disaster of the whole battle for the Confederates, because you decide to sit back, not to go in with your troops. You should be in front of your troops, so you can get shot first. That's what happens. But you don't go in at all. You're behind the log, back up on Oak Hill, and you don't put skirmishers out in front. Yes?
Along with that, so is it uncommon for the leaders to stay behind?
Yes.
Because it sounded like
Yes.
from what we read, on the other side, on the U.S. side, the leaders are fighting, for example, Reynolds, Chamberlain.
Well, in Pickett's charge, how many? Pickett has three brigades in his division. Let's do it another way. Do you know what the difference between a company grade officer and a field grade officer is? Company grade officers are second lieutenants and lieutenants and captains. Field grade officers are majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels. In Pickett's entire division, only one field grade officer or general wasn't killed, wounded, or captured. Only one in the entire division. So it's a very dangerous business during the Civil War, even if you have a colonel. A colonel is a lot of rank. A brigadier general even more. But brigadier generals are expected to go in with their men. He didn't send skirmishers out. If you attack, you put part of your unit out in front to sort of figure out what's in front of you. He didn't do that. And so his men, his North Carolinians, just walked into this absolute death trap and were butchered. Butchered. 500 of them shot down in about 2 minutes while he's sitting behind the log back up on the hill. And meanwhile, O'Neill has already had his own disaster because he lost control of his brigade. But part of this also takes you up one notch in the chain of command, because Robert Rhodes is in charge of those two guys. He's ordered to make an assault. He just happened to have his two worst brigade commanders in front. They changed the order of march as they went, because if you march in front, there's less dust. So you don't want to be in the back, you want to be in the front. He'd rotate brigades. They happened to be in front, so he put them in the front row for the assaults. He knew they weren't the best. He knew they were the worst brigade commanders he had. So the question about Rhodes is he culpable for this? Should he have waited a little bit longer and brought his better brigadiers up to the front and avoided what turned into a mini catastrophe for them there? They overcame it because the other brigades came in and did a good job. But those two, Rhodes made them, I think that's, part of that is on Rhodes. Justin and then Scott.
I guess getting briefly to the question of generals in front or behind for the Union versus the Confederacy, wouldn't be the generals who were leading in an attack. You would not put anyone out in front for a defense.
No. You lead in the attack. You lead in the attack. Confederates actually get shot in a little higher percentage, general officers do, than Union general officers. Confederates had, I think, 424 or 425 generals of all grades during the war, and more than 90 of them were killed. More than 90 of the 400 and some. So, and lots of others would have been wounded. Yes?
We talked in the first class just about how it has this problem finding capable men to rank them. It seems like there's an obvious cause for that. If they're running head first and getting shot first, why, other than, the United States with his ship?
Yes, intellectually that's true. Boy, we found a great colonel. Maybe he shouldn't get in front of his troops. And the troops will say, either he's in front of us, or we're not going to pay attention to him. A British observer had a great observation about this. He said, every ounce of authority that Confederate officers possess is purchased with their own blood. He said that in 1862. Every ounce of authority they possess is purchased with their own blood. If you're not in front, they are not going to take you seriously as a commander. It's a really difficult situation, and you've read these things. I mean, Winfield Scott Hancock is a corps commander. He's badly wounded. Dan Sickles is a corps commander. He loses a leg. John Reynolds is a corps commander. He's shot in the head and killed. There are only 7 corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac. Only 7. There are 3 of them who become serious casualties and 1 a fatality. So it's much more dangerous then. Much more dangerous.
Are they typically dressed like a peacock, like Stuart? I mean, what's the difference?
No,
between
the
them?
peacock stands out, Stuart stands out in his peacockian elements. Most of them would have worn a kind of standard uniform, and some of them wore odd things that didn't even look like uniforms. But for the most part, you'd have a gray frock coat on if you're a Confederate, you'd have a blue one on if you're a United States officer, and some would dress better than others. Hancock dressed immaculately, always had clean collars. People talked about that all the time. His collars were always clean, which suggests a lot of collars weren't, but they would generally look like they're in uniforms. But they're in front, and they're often on horses. So you're all defending. Gee, I wonder who the leader is in this bunch of men coming toward me. Oh, maybe it's Michael, the guy on the horse. Maybe he's the one I should shoot first. And so you shoot him first. First shoot the guys on the horses. Then work your way down from there. But start with the guys on the horses, and chances are that you will cause greater damage because the effectiveness of the unit will slip. It's a very tough, that's a great question, Jay. And it's one of the real dilemmas. It's hard to find these guys, but some of the best ones are often the ones who get shot the most often. James Longstreet's got a hideous wound a little bit later in the war that almost killed him. Stonewall Jackson got killed. Richard Ewell lost a leg. A.P. Hill killed in action late in the war. Jeb Stuart killed in action. We've taken care of the entire high command of the Army of Northern Virginia. All of them killed or very badly wounded during the war. That's the top echelon. And Lee came this close to being shot on 3 different battlefields. Scott.
So we talked a little bit about the incompetence of like the civilians, officers, but
William Nelson Pendleton's a West Pointer.
Yeah, but
no, I'm just.
Yeah, but well, that was going to be my point. Like, we also see like the incompetence of like Howard and Hancock, and then Hill and Heath, and all those guys. And I know last time I was the one person defending Meade, but
no, there were other Meade defenders in here. Don't make yourself a heroic defender of Meade. That's unseemly, and no one likes that when you stake out that kind of position.
I still struggle to understand how we can have like such a huge battle and not have some high commanders who are the heroes.
We do. I hope you read the chapter about Caldwell's division. Did you read that chapter? It's an exemplary battle for him. He gets orders. His division is facing one direction, and rather than taking the very long time it would take normally to get them completely turned around the way they should be turned around, he tells them, basically, turn around right where you are, and we're going to go like this. He gets them to the battlefield in 10 minutes instead of an hour. And then, so that chapter is a wonderful explanation of how effectively, and he did it, and he was criticized later for not following the book. Only in the Army of the Potomac would that happen. I promise you that in the Army of Northern Virginia, if somebody got something done in 10 minutes that should have taken an hour, people would have said, well, yeah, he did it in 10 minutes, but he didn't do it by the book. He should have done it by the book, and then maybe he would have been too late by the time he got to the wheat field. It's an interesting difference there. Caldwell did a very, very good job. And you rattled off a string of H's who didn't do well. Hill and Heath and Hancock and Howard, I think. I'm not sure what Hancock, I think Hancock did a pretty good job too.
He was at fault in talked about in the positioning on Cemetery Hill when he came in to help Howard, I guess. But
Yes, well, Howard ranked him, but Hancock took over basically because Meade told him to. So they had a little bit of a problem there. Everybody makes some mistakes, but a lot of them did a very good job. We've been focusing on the ones who didn't do a good job in some ways, yes.
Like he's getting to Meade, my one critique of him would be previously was not imposing his will on the enemy. Do you think he really knew that Lee was going to try to attack the middle that last day? Because if so...
No. Well, how could he know that? No. I think that's retrospective. Because what was Lee's plan on the third day? What was Lee's plan when he woke up in the morning on July 3rd? Was his plan the Pickett Pettigrew assault?
I thought there was a quote in there that...
There is a quote where he says he knew that that's what would happen.
Right. You don't think, okay.
And I knew the Colts would try a long post pattern late in the, and they did. Gee, I knew that. No, he didn't know that. And Lee wasn't going to do that initially. Lee initially was going to do what he did on the second day. That's what he wanted to do. And he didn't because circumstances changed early in the morning. And so if Meade actually was sure that's what Lee was going to do, it was dead wrong because Lee was going to do something else until circumstances changed. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I mean, if you even imagine, you wouldn't put like Chamberlain in the middle after that he was left on the flank, like almost his division. Is that what no,
Chamberlain? He's a regimental commander.
Regiment.
He has
So his
about
regiment-
350 men.
Yeah, he almost lost all his men, and then I mean they had to fight with the bayonet, and then you put him in the middle. If you ever imagined that the middle could be attacked, so I don't think he ever was Hancock who put him Chamberlain in the middle. Was Meade?
Well, Chamberlain, we're hung up on where Chamberlain was fairly insignificant in the larger frame. Nobody woke up and said, "Where's Joshua Chamberlain?" That's what I want to know. That isn't what they did. He was sent there because they thought he'd been in the hard fighting before, and they thought there wouldn't be a lot of fighting there. So that goes against that notion. But where Chamberlain was, it's not like where's Waldo. I mean, if you find Chamberlain, you don't necessarily find the key thing that's going on. Aaron, you had your hand up.
So I was wondering, you gave us this handout and it shows just the discrepancy in terms of resources between the Union and the Confederacy. And you also mentioned earlier that if you're attacking, then you're more likely to lose more men.
Absolutely.
So I guess I kind of go back to the first essay, the Nolan essay in this book, and why it was such an offense, like why the Confederates having less men and having more people that are irreplaceable in terms of their commanders would possibly be put in a position of being on the offense. And I know that it talks about how, they didn't want to wait until like Meade was able to get all of his men there, but at the same time, like they were the ones initiating most of these conflicts. So I in terms of Longstreet, it's like Longstreet was the one who had more of a defensive warfare strategy. So
At Gettysburg he did, yes.
Yeah.
He didn't everywhere, but he did at Gettysburg.
but it just seems like,
How did the Confederates attacked on the first day.
yes,
How did that work out?
I mean, depends on,
No, I think it's pretty clear how it worked out on the first day. Who would you, who wins the first day by any measure? The Confederates do. I mean, they have a huge tactical success on the first day.
but you look at their like losses, like they couldn't afford to lose as many people, so even if they're losing more as a percentage, it's still,
Okay, what's the goal of the Army in Northern Virginia?
they want.
The ultimate goal.
They want their objective is to make it so that the Army of the Potomac gives up and doesn't care
That's the ultimate goal of the Army in Northern Virginia. That is it. How do you achieve that? We've talked about that a little bit. You don't achieve it by crushing United States military forces because you know you cannot do that. You do not because of the figures you have there. You've got 1 million military-aged men, males, 1.1 million maybe. The other side is 4 million. And much greater industrial capacity and so forth. But you're lucky because you don't have to do that to them. What do you have to do to win? Aaron, what is the key to winning this war?
You have to wear them down.
Wear whom down?
Like the Army of the Potomac, I guess.
There's somebody even more important than that you have to wear down.
Isn't it just the civilians?
It's the
who will want
civilians, because these are democratic republics. If you can convince the civilians of the United States that it isn't worth it, you've won. And so it's a race on the part of the Confederates. It's a race between, can we convince the United States civilian population that it isn't worth it before we run out of men? That's the race. And different Confederates had different views on that. Lee's view was, how do you convince the civilians of the United States? It's what's the very best way to persuade them that it's not worth it?
Go into their backyard and hurt them.
Kick their armies around. That's how you do it. You inflict big defeats on a battlefield because that has enormous impact behind the lines. There's an absolutely direct correlation between how your armies are doing and what the expectations of the overall war effort are on the civilian populations. And Lee knows, everybody reads the other side's papers, Lee knows what the impact of the 7 days and Second Bull Run and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville were. He knew that the political situation in the United States in the early summer of 1863 was as fraught as it had ever been. He knew there was tremendous unhappiness with emancipation, tremendous unhappiness with conscription, a huge drop in morale because of Chancellorsville. He knew all those things. And he knew as well that success on United States soil would have a multiplying effect on all those things. So, and he also knows he's going to lose a lot of men. It's Allen's essay, Alan Nolan's essay it's not as if Lee didn't understand what was going on. He did understand what was going on, but he believed the most plausible way to get this was for the best Confederate army, which was his, and he knew that, and anybody with half a brain knew that. The best way to get this was for his army to humiliate the Army of Potomac, which was the most important United States Army, and he had done it 4 times already. And he knew how that complicated Abraham Lincoln's life. And so, that, all of which is not to say that he shouldn't have stopped attacking at Gettysburg. I think he should. I've told you that. I think Porter Alexander is exactly right. He should have hunkered down. We won a great victory on July 1st, said Porter Alexander. Now make them knock us off Seminary Ridge. They can't do it. They've never knocked us off anything, said Alexander. Let them knock us off of here. That's what he would have said. And what do you think Lee's response to that would have been? Is he just a doddering old man? Does he just not get it anymore? Why would he attack on the 2nd? He's a smart guy. He's working with a very high IQ. Much smarter than most of the people around him. Why would a very smart person decide to do what he did? Killer Angel says it's because his heart hurts. And he doesn't know, maybe this is his last chance and everything is blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah.
Well, I think he said that in every experience or information he had from battles before it proved that his army could do this. So.
Especially his infantry.
Yeah, his infantry could do that. So
You had your hand up?
Yeah, by not attacking on the 2nd day, it allows them the option to retreat and pick a different spot to battle. So he'd already kind of had the momentum and felt like, again,
What are some factors that are important in how a battle unfolds? And never mind just numbers, because the Confederates are at a disadvantage with numbers. What are some things that come into play? Morale, huge.
Yeah, he talked about how he didn't ever want the other side to see them retreat. And also, he wanted to have the morale up.
How is the morale in his army?
Good.
It's way better than good. Good is a nice understated way to put it. It's spectacular going into, okay, morale is one thing. What's another one? It's another M word. Heather, and then Michelle?
I don't know if it's right.
Well, you don't have to use an M word.
He was new, and he knew that he was just taking over, so he wasn't really prepared.
He knew that Meade was new, and so that might have played. But I would say, but never mind just Gettysburg. I'm talking in a broader sense. What are some factors that would play a role?
Who's kind of got him in a stranglehold? They had the momentum. Why not?
Momentum is the other M word that I'm thinking of. Momentum is important. He's generated tremendous momentum on the first day, and he held Ewell accountable for not following through with that momentum. He thought he had a missed opportunity on the first day. But I think it's very important to keep in mind those two things, momentum and morale on a battlefield. And he had both of those going into Pennsylvania, and he had them after the first day's fighting. It confirmed. What he saw on the first day confirmed what he thought about his army. He realized they'd been lucky to a degree because of where the units came in, but they had, once again, routed at least part of the Army of the Potomac, just as they had at Chancellorsville. So I think those, Aaron, those are important factors. And we can argue, of course, endlessly, and Lee afterwards said, even as dull a fellow as I am, looking back and knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have done what I did.
It has to be partly ego though, right? I mean, he had been criticized for being defensive earlier.
That was a long time ago. Yeah, that's way in the, that's not even in the rearview mirror anymore.
But
He's been aggressive for a year.
That's what Longstreet wanted, right? And that's what he was pushing.
Longstreet is pushing, Longstreet is not pushing to hunker down on, he's pushing to disengage and move the whole army farther to the south. That, and Lee and others, Alan doesn't talk about this, but it's not all that easy to just disengage the army and then move across the front of the other army. That can also cause problems, can open opportunities for your opponent. But Longstreet wants a more, he doesn't want to just pull back to Seminary Ridge. He wants to disengage and move the whole army off to the south and try to create problems closer to Washington. That's what he was thinking about. How about somebody other than Longstreet or Lee or, yes?
This isn't necessarily directly about anybody in particular, but in several of the articles it talks about the communication between commanders and subordinates. It seemed mostly that it was, here, go take this note of some form or fashion of a runner and physically can't find. To what extent was that the predominant way of communication versus telegraph or flags and signals?
They had the semaphore, they had what they call the wig-wag system of motion telegraphy, which is with flags you can signal, but they don't do that on battlefields because, that's almost never used on a battlefield. They string telegraphic lines on a handful of battlefields, but there's no time to do it in a battle like this. You have to have been in a place. So it's not just the predominant way to send messages, it's the way to send messages. You send an aide or a courier. And sometimes you do it with a written order, and sometimes you do it with a verbal order. There's another opportunity for error to creep in. Michelle, I want you to go tell Justin, and then I give you this long message. Go tell him. And you go, and Pete shoots at you, and Ben almost captures you, and you get to Justin and think, he wants you to... And you might get half of it right or 2/3 of it right, but maybe you get a really important part of it wrong. So that's another thing that goes wrong in trying to keep control of a battlefield. And on Lee's side, there's no question that he's culpable for having, we've talked about this before, too small a staff. He did not have a large enough staff to run his army. And there he's making a point, it's a stupid point, that you should be carrying muskets, not lounging around Army headquarters. That's the point he's making, right?
So about communication in that sense, right down at the front lines, did they also use, some of the reading talks a little bit about music, that some of the...
Well, there are calls, yes.
So that you could actually direct troops in a certain fashion about to charge?
The troops understand there's a whole range of bugle calls. And yes, they learn those. Because another thing I hope they will talk about, why do you put the flag in the middle of the regiment? Pardon?
It's always right next to it.
Because I know if you're holding the flag, I know where I'm supposed to be. When the regiment is in position and the flag is there, I'm right here. And Bryce, you're right here. So when it's incredibly loud and incredibly smoky, if we can see the flag, we have some sense of where we're supposed to be, which is why you almost certainly will not be unscathed in the battle. You pick up the flag. Right after we shoot Michael off his horse, we're going to shoot you because you're the next most important person. Shoot the guy with the flag, and that removes a critical point of reference. Once it gets noisy and loud, it's hard for Lee to communicate. It's hard for our major to communicate who's back here in the midst of all this chaos. It's hard, and even yelling, I can yell at the top of my voice, and Scott, you can't hear me. We're this far away. You can't hear anything I'm saying to you. But that's a very difficult part of being on a battlefield and why things get out of control as well. Once it starts, it's hard to control it in any real sense. Communication's very, very difficult. Very difficult. Luis?
So if the guy with the flag is important.
Really important.
And every time the guy dies, so you know if you get the flag gonna die.
Well, you know you have a much better chance of getting shot. You don't know that you're going to die, but you know you have a much better chance of getting shot if you're the color, if you have the flag.
But you didn't make something that, an object that moves with the flag, or a guy with a shield thing, I don't know, something that,
Something that doesn't have a flag?
no, something that is not
Glory.
easy to kill, like you don't easy kill it, but moves, right? Either an object or somebody with the
Armor?
Yeah.
There's no armor that would protect you, and I mean, they would have thought of that if it was possible. There just isn't. That's, you just take the risk.
Because he doesn't need to shoot, he just needs to hold the flag, so he could.
He needs to hold the flag in front of the regiment, not just hold the flag somewhere. He's here, and the regiment's here.
Like a trolley with a flag or something, I don't know.
Yes.
So say that Chad holds the flag, he gets shot, the
Mhm.
flag falls in front of me.
You pick it up.
Why would I pick it up?
Yeah. Why?
No, we can't understand that, can we? Why would they? Why would they march across? Because that's what you do. Because you think there's something at stake, and that's something that you do. Now, would everybody pick it up? No, Brian wouldn't. Brian would pretend he didn't see it fall down. But either one of you two would pick it up, because yes, Brian would say, "Oh, look, Haley's Comet," but someone else would pick up the flag there. They just would, and it's part of the. I think that's part of what's difficult to recapture. I really do. It's part of way back when I talked about why does Justin, who's from New Hampshire, care if Michelle, who's from South Carolina, a state that is always, with apologies to any South Carolinians here, a pain in the ass. Why does he care that they leave the Union? But he does, because the Union as the Union means something. It means something. And it means something whether your side wins or my side. And having the flag up can make a very great difference in a micro level about whether your side wins or not. And so you do pick it up. Somebody picks it up. There are a number of battles where 3, 4, 5, 6 color bearers will be shot in one battle. And if your regiment loses its flag, you're completely, I know, incredulous, but if your regiment loses its flag, that is a big, big deal. Huge deal. Huge deal. It puts a stain on your unit. The Federals, after Pickett's charge, they gathered up a bunch of the Virginia battle flags and dragged them around in the dirt on Cemetery Ridge. And that is a very powerful message to send. Here they are. Their banners are in the dirt. Huge message. Huge. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yes. I thought I detected a hand movement.
So
back
when we're
there.
talking about the goal, ultimate goal, Lee's ultimate goal that he has to kind of wear down the Union, how far down through his subordinates is that communicated? Like when they're on the battlefield, like how are they thinking that at all? Do they know?
I don't think they're thinking about what Lee, I don't think they're thinking about what will the Union civilian population think about this. No, I don't think they're thinking that.
But do they understand that as like an ultimate goal?
What they understand in Lee's army is how important they are in the war. They understand how important they are as a symbol to the Confederacy. They understand how important they are as an expression of the Confederacy that United States armies don't seem to be able to control. They absolutely understand that and take tremendous, and they get reinforced from the home front all the time in that regard, all the time. A tremendous amount of very positive reinforcement from the home front, directed toward the Army of Northern Virginia. And when they go home, if they get a furlough, they get treated differently. Georgia sends men to both armies. There are great letters from Georgia officers from Lee's army. They go home and they say, well, there were a couple of officers from the Army of Tennessee here as well, but it's not like being from the Army of Northern Virginia. Because the Army of Tennessee's record is 0-9, and the Army of Northern Virginia is 6-1. So who gets the love at home? I mean, you get a disproportionate amount of that love if you are from the Army of Northern Virginia, and you want somebody in your company to pick up the flag too if it falls down. You want somebody to have some sense of that there's a reason to do that and there's a payoff that's beyond just what's happening with you too. I mean, if you can build that sense of community and esprit, all the things that you read about, of course there's loyalty. What does Justin really care about? This comes out of World War II. All he cares about is Bryce and Ben. That's all you need to understand about an army. It's all about your buddies on either side of you. Well, of course, There's a very large element of truth in that. But in the Civil War, it's more than Ben and Bryce at stake. They really do think beyond that. Ideology is important, not for everybody in both armies, but it's important for a lot of them. And we know it because they talk about it in letters that they know no one else is ever going to read, or in their diaries. I'm going to tell my diary something, not the truth, but I'm going to tell myself something I don't really believe. I think you can usually trust diaries. They're my favorite sources. Letters are good, diaries are better, because it's for you. You're talking to yourself. And there's more than just small unit cohesion. Although that's really important. That's really important. I think that's why so many Democratic soldiers in the election of 1864 voted for Lincoln instead of voting for George B. McClellan. They didn't like Lincoln. They didn't like Republicans. They hated Republicans. But Lincoln, they knew, would push the war through to an end. And they had a sense that they had so many comrades who'd been killed or maimed to that point in the war, that to stop the war would be an absolute betrayal of everything that those other men had done. They write about that all the time. We've got to finish this. We have to finish this. It has to be finished. Too much has been invested. It has to be finished. And they thought civilians were too quick to say, maybe we don't need to finish it. It's costing too much. And the soldiers' response was, what the hell is it costing them? We're the ones who are really paying the price, and they're the ones who are saying they don't know whether they want to finish it or not? That really upset them. They said harsh things about people who took that attitude. Did anybody pay attention to Francis Channing Barlow? Did he emerge at all from the pages of these books for you? I'm going to take that as a resounding no, he did not. He did what Dan Sickles did, only he did it on a smaller scale. He did it on the first day, and he did it out north of town. I hope the Marines talk about this. He did it out north of town when initially the fight is going this way, and then the Confederates show up on Oak Hill, and the Federals have to deploy north of town as well to face the threat there. There's a piece of high ground here called Barlow's Knoll now, named after Barlow, and another little plateau here where an almshouse sat during the Civil War. His initial orders were, the initial Union line was like this, north of town. Barlow looked just a little bit farther north and saw this knoll that's a little bit higher than the knoll the almshouse was on. And so without orders, he went out there. And when he went out there, it made them reconfigure their line. So it no longer looked like that. It ended up looking like this. And in very quick order, Confederates came in from here and overran Barlow's line, and Barlow was hideously wounded and so forth. But it's another example. He did essentially what Sickles did. He put the whole line in jeopardy. He left his own unit, which was a division, open to a problematical future, and then paid a very high price for it. But he doesn't get nearly as much attention as Sickles does. He's just part of a larger collapse that the 11th Corps had up here. And my point here is that a lot of what we think are great controversies and maybe are unusual end up that way simply because they get more attention at a certain time, like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain gets more attention than many other officers. There are lots of things going on.
Is that the same case with Slocum? Like the chapter
this
was kind of, couldn't get a real sense of whether people thought he was a good guy or a bad guy.
Yeah, they were, Slocum was one of those sort of gray men. He doesn't really emerge. That chapter basically is pretty hard on Slocum. Slocum doesn't do much good at Gettysburg. He doesn't do anything really bad at Gettysburg, so he doesn't get much attention. That's the longest piece on Slocum at Gettysburg, is the one that you read there. And it's pretty dull. It's not the most scintillating chapter in that book. It isn't. It's sort of dull. Just like Slocum. Slocum ended up out in Sherman's army later in the war. We've got 3.5 minutes left. And all I can say is, damn it. I wish we had more time than that, but yes.
Just another indirect topic that wasn't necessarily discussed particularly in
Good.
it, but was touched on, was the supply lines and the importance of those and
Yes.
the roles that they played in You see several instances where they're short on ammunition or low on ammunition.
Yep.
We're defending with cavalry supply lines. Can we talk just a little bit about
Yes,
the wall?
Lee, of course, Lee has a harder problem there than the Federals do because his supply line goes across South Mountain, then runs southward through the Cumberland Valley and crosses the Potomac and goes to the Shenandoah Valley. It's a much longer supply line. He can get food in Pennsylvania. He's getting lots of it. His guys are eating very well in Pennsylvania, but he can't get ordnance. And they're running out of ordnance at Gettysburg. So that is a problem for the Confederates. They have a much greater problem in that regard than the Army of the Potomac does. They have other ordnance coming up, but they're a lot farther from their sources for it, and it's a much more tenuous line than the line that is feeding the Army of the Potomac, feeding the Army everything it needs, the Army of the Potomac. And Lee talks about that. He's disingenuous about that. He said that his supply line was, his whole supply line was very fragile, and that really isn't true. I mean, one part of it was, but not a lot of it. But with ordnance it was. Porter Alexander's obsessed about ordnance since he's in charge of guns, and when you're out, and that's a real problem. And he was almost out by the time the bombardment. It's interesting, most accounts say the bombardment lasted 2 hours before the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. And Porter Alexander says it lasted about 35 minutes. He was in charge of it. I kind of think and he's this meticulous engineer. I mean, he really is. He was third in his class at West Point and a very bright fellow. I think he was probably closer. You can shoot up a lot of ammunition in 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time to be firing the other way. So I'd err on the side of a little shorter period there, but I'm going to make a prediction now, and you can tell me when you come back from your field work. I want to know how long the Marines say the bombardment lasted, if they talk about that. I'll be interested in that. I'm also interested in their take on Jaime Longstreet. I want to know all about that. I want to know how they treat him and whether they think he's a far-seeing modern officer and not a sort of backward-looking, out-of-touch, chivalric R.E. Lee. Be very interested in that. Pardon?
You're going to perform anything there?
I'm not going to be there. No. I would like to be. No, I'm not going to be there. That's the answer to that.
If we disagree with that,
I'm going to be here reading term papers. I'd much rather be with you. I'm going to get 135 papers on Thursday. Any last anything that you want to bring up for this week? You're beaten into absolute submission. There's not a single anything. All right. I'll see you on Monday. No, Tuesday. Whenever. What day do we get back together here? Tuesday. Okay, that's when I'll see you.
Thank you, Gary.